Good afternoon, Brian.
How are you doing today, sir?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing good. We had rain for the night, and then
Oh,
we get a
nice.
couple hours break, and more is coming.
The apricot trees will be happy.
Yeah, they're bending with fruit.
Oh, amazing.
Unbelievable.
That's
Yeah,
great. And it's early still. You've got another month of ripening at least.
yeah, at least.
Yeah.
God willing, and the creek don't rise.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Um, so I don't know if we said this on air or not, but we've mentioned a couple of times that you've had a number of really interesting teachers, and we talked about maybe doing an episode about them. And at first, I thought maybe we do one on Peter Lee and one on So and et cetera. But I realized that uh, there's a story to the interrelationship between these teachers, and probably there are chapter appropriateness elements to talking about each teacher relative to kind of the trajectory of your own development. And I thought that might be a good frame for it. So, kind of Peter probably representing a launch, and then these other pieces representing like different refinements. So, if you would be willing to kind of share, you know, who are the set of teachers and what do they kind of represent to you, and then we can kind of talk about the set of them.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of these people, I realize, rather than a teacher student, it was more like an apprenticeship. Rather than in a classroom of 40 people, it was usually more one on one. And that's why I'm a great advocate for apprenticeships in general. And it might be that apprenticeships lead us to or they work better in a hands on scenario. You can't always have 40 people looking over your shoulder. And apprenticeships also, there has to be a kind of a matching between the master and the apprentice, or else uh, it's like with an apprenticeship, together you and the teacher are focused on the subject. But when you get a classroom of 40 students, now the teacher has to focus on the delivery system almost as much or more than the payload, so to speak. And you get running the class and you get all the interrelationships of the class, and teaching becomes a lot more of the job, and the experiencing of the topic or the phenomenon somehow can take us a back seat to that. In other words, you've got a social phenomenon that's going on that's different than the work, maybe. And so apprenticeships kind of allow us to just focus on the work. Um, and so, I think that, my first a serious teacher, I would say, was Peter. Although, it's an interesting story of how I got to Peter. I was a Midwest kid that then got moved to New York in about fourth grade, I guess, and it was a much faster, much more challenging environment than the Midwest. Uh, and so, I think also coming in from another place, you didn't find, you have the different job of fitting in. Whereas if you're in a place where you grew up with you kind of grew into your place. So I had that experience of sort of being dropped into this environment. And I think I first started with martial arts with a continuing education class at the elementary school, and it was a couple of guys. One guy was a young guy who ran a carpet cleaning business, which is interesting because one of my longtime students then later, ran and is still running a carpet cleaning business. And but we were, his big area where he would use in his shop to roll out carpets and to clean them was where we would practice. And and then another guy that was actually, he was a brown belt, and His buddy was a jeweler who was a black belt, and those were the 2 guys that I studied with first, and that was in the lineage of, what they called Odoquan, Odoquan is maybe the military version, and the Chungdo of Taekwondo was, a master named Duksung Sun, who was out of Mercer Street in New York City, and, he was quite an interesting character, and but this was the oldest form of Taekwondo, which was based on the Shotokan systems, because the founder of Taekwondo had actually been a black belt in Shotokan, which is a Japanese style, and this had to do with the relationship between Japan and Korea, when Japan actually occupied Korea for a while, and, so so the forms that we did were the same forms that the Shotokan style did. Shotokan style, interestingly, is not an ancient style. It was founded in 1922 by Gishin Funakoshi, who was bringing things from Okinawa. Came to Okinawa from southern China. So this was, a transplant of a transplant of a transplant. And later on, I read a book by the successor of Gishin Funakoshi, and that's one of the things that sort of led me to Tai Chi into the internal styles. There's some curious things that make it into Shotokan that came through the Southern Shaolin system that I suspect it's from, like a Fukian White Crane system maybe, and they'll do there's certain movements that happen that are very, iconic for that style, and there are also some movements that the Shotokan master the successor to Gishin Funakoshi's name was Shigeru Agami, and he used to write things about changes in technique, and that's what caught my eye was when he said things like, "We used to think that all strikes happen in straight lines, and then we realized no strikes happen in straight lines." And he talks about not knowing what's going on with some parts of his own system and going to China and to the Tai Chi masters to start asking them, "What's this about?" And that's when I kind of snapped that, well, rather than, going through that lineage, maybe I should go straight to the same people that he went to, see what I can get from that. And that became a major vein. But the interesting thing about getting to Peter Lee was that I was in this other school and I had done it to the point where I was going to test to brown belt, which is right before black belt. And in that school, you never took a test that you weren't going to pass. If you weren't going to pass, the teacher wouldn't let you test. So I'd already been told that I was going to pass and get my brown belt, and then a week before the test, this other school opened up in my town, and I went to this other school, knowing that my school was the best, of course, because when you're 14, you're not going to think any deeper than that, maybe. And then I met Peter. He had 6 students. That's how big his school was at the time, and a tiny postage stamp of a school. And and he told me, he said, "Well, you're almost brown belt. You should go back to your school. Your cup is full." He told me. But before he did that, he said, "Okay, well, you're brown belt. Let's fight." Now, he was a fourth dan black belt, and I had only fought a black belt once. And in that first school, when you were fighting, this was a big deal. And everybody sat around in a circle, and 2 people would fight, and everybody would watch. And it was very formalized. Whoever had the highest rank, they always let the lowest ranked person attack first, and they give a signal, okay, go ahead, take a shot, and it was very. Then I get into Peter's school, and it would be like a round robin where everybody's fighting, and you're just changing, you're fighting, and you're changing, and you're fighting, and it would go on for an hour and 45 minutes that way. Totally different attitude. It wasn't a big ceremonial thing. It was like something that you did like track work. And then later in the internal traditions, that sort of made sense when I'd see these sayings like, we fight like going for a walk. We strike the opponent like snapping our fingers, right? Very natural, very, there's just no hyper formalized anything, just like natural, like a ripe fruit falls from a tree. And But so I get to Peter's school and he says, "Okay, well, you're brown belt, fight with me." So I get out there and fight with him, and the style the style that I had done was a no contact style. And he was, this guy was Vietnam, 2 tours of duty, Green Beret. He was in the real world. And so we started fighting, and I'm, throwing strikes to 1 inch away from the target. And he fought me with his hands behind his back. All he did was stepping, moving in, moving out, and he'd be too close, bumping into me, but he was always doing that when my own movements were so disorganized, I couldn't do anything about it. And then he's too far away, and then, so when we finished, he basically showed that I had nothing, and that, God forbid I should learn that in the street the hard way. Uh, But so then that was when he told me, "Okay, well, you're already brown belt. You have to go home. You're already a assistant teacher and everything." So then I came back the next day, right? I'm greatly disturbed by this. And I said, "Yeah, you told me yesterday my cup was full, but now you spilled my cup all over. Now now my cup's empty." So, so I think I have to join. You have to let me join because I came with a full cup. Now you spilled it, so you have to fill it back up for me, please. and and so he reluctantly agreed. He said, "Okay, it's going to be harder for me than for you, though."
That's a
and
great line.
yeah, and and so I went from brown belt, which is to say, having been told I was brown belt, back to yellow belt, which is your first belt. And I was second highest ranked in his school. I was student number 7. Very auspicious, I thought, number 7. But so, uh, so I went back to yellow belt, and it was extremely difficult. The highest ranked guy was a guy who was green belt, but he had been in the military and he had learned from Peter in England when he was stationed in England. And so he already had some advance. Well, so he's first ranked. I'm second ranked at yellow belt or high yellow belt, something like that. And his brother-in-law and all his buddies were third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, in rank. So they were not particularly pleased with this 15-year-old, 14-year-old punk outranking them. That's ridiculous as far as they were concerned. So every time I fought with these guys, they were trying to prove to me that they were better than me. And I mean, it was just, in those days, it wasn't a once a week thing. It was like you went to class every day. And it was the hardest thing in the world for me to go to class. But I did have this realization that, if I can do this and I can get through this, I probably can do anything, you know? And I think, of course, I had to leave, and I didn't mention this part. I was brown belt in this other school. I was an assistant instructor, and I was good buddies with all these guys. But here I was, so I had the social weight on one side, but I mean, I saw what I saw.
That's
This
an
was
interesting example of moral courage, going back to the conversation we had a few weeks ago about how speaking truth to power is one thing, um, but doing the right thing regardless of what your peers think about it is another. And the social pressure can be such a huge factor in keeping us in our um, with our blinders on, right?
Yeah, yeah. No, and that was exactly the choice. And I stood there at that crossroads, and I had friends, and I was not hiding what my experience was. I was like, dudes, check this out. I mean, like, what about it? Right. But because of where I was positioned in the first school, when I left, then there was a niche. So those guys, they didn't leave. They didn't think about it twice, and ultimately they never continued. They went on to playing tennis or, doing other things. But for me, now it was like I had paid a price for this. And, so so I basically worked with him, with Peter Lee until I went to college at the end of my junior year in high school. And, and I think that's when I first got exposed to Tai Chi Chuan. But I had made it up to I guess I'd made it up to brown belt. Back to brown. I finally made it back up to where I supposedly had been, by the time I went to college. And those were, in those days, typically people would go to the storefront karate school and they could leave in 2 years with a black belt. In our school, it was closer to 6 or 7 years. And what Cho was very Chomson Cho, who was Peter Lee's master, our grandmaster, uh, he was clear in those days. 1 out of 1,000 people is black belt. And when you're running a school that's a hard fighting school, that's self-evident because you see people wash out. They didn't like. I mean, you're going to get bruised. You're going to get. They would call a bruise a club patch, right? But already things were. In the beginning of those days, babysitting schools were not really a thing yet. Like if you went to a school, it was probably relatively serious about what you're doing. You weren't going to be in a class where the average grade age was 8, right?
I suspect that there are a lot of babysitting schools around now, but with the popularity of MMA, I see like Brazilian jiu-jitsu schools all over the place now, and I suspect most of them are pretty serious, where people are rolling around for hours and people show up every day and
Yep, yep.
and work it.
And well,
So
the
I think
BJJ
the culture
guys,
has changed.
that was kind of like a little revolution that happened in martial arts is relatively recent. And it has come kind of after a good 20, 25 years of the babysitting school thing. What people don't understand often is, the idea of ranks, colored belt ranks, that's not an ancient tradition. That was invented in the early 1900s by Jigoro Kano, who was the founder of judo. And he created that ranking system. And within that ranking system, the colored ranks are called ryu, which means boy. And the black belt ranks are called dan, first dan, second dan, third dan, means man. So when an 11-year-old child comes up to me and says, I'm fourth dan black belt, all I know is that his mom kept paying the bills every month at the school. But there's no way an 11-year-old is a man. And it's not possible for them to have gone through what needs to be gone through for that first dawn to be meaningful. Somebody just got paid. And, there's this saying that if you put a clown in the White House, you don't make the clown into a president, you just make the White House into a circus. That there's kind of a version of that. You don't help your style by making a bunch of 9-year-olds into second on black belts. Maybe you paid your rent, but everybody who was part of a real lineage looks at you like you're an idiot. And so I don't think babysitting schools are good. Uh, there have been certain styles that have really focused in on that, and they tend to be the more simplistic styles,
That makes sense.
as you would
And,
imagine.
and
Yeah.
I wouldn't say they're not good, but there's definitely a huge gap between the story, the narrative that they convey to their students and their students' parents and all that stuff compared to the reality of a school like Peter's. So, like, people like you had the opportunity. It wasn't a babysitting school that you came from per se, but it was somewhere on that spectrum compared to Peter's school, right?
Right, right,
Where you
right,
were learning no contact um, and the brown belt didn't amount to as much as you had thought it would.
right. And by the
Um,
same token, in Peter's school, You were not gonna be 65 or 70 and 100 pounds overweight and, not able to be extremely physical and have a chance at getting into high rank. Like, I mean, in those days, it was considered just a basic thing to be running miles on the beach in the sand, kicking a soccer ball just to do that, and so if you couldn't put that kind of thing in, you were not gonna make it through a 2-hour class. And so a lot of people, I mean, that just ruled out a lot of people. But at the same time, you know, the guy that I trained with a lot, who I had to fight for my black belt test, he went into the PKA, Professional Karate Association competitions, knocked out the number 2 guy in 56 seconds in the first round. And I know that, this was televised and it was a big deal in those days, and Master Cho was a little disgruntled because he wanted to be on TV coaching between rounds. There was never a second round, right? And then later on, unfortunately, at another tournament, one of our black belts was fighting a huge guy, 6'7". And this was a guy, I got a chance to see him. I never had to fight him, but he was not a good etiquette guy. He was somebody that would, tell you what he was going to do, and a lot of what we now call shit talking. And the guy that he was put up against was a this guy was a student at one of the aerospace schools, and I think he was working on his third master's degree. Was from Jamaica, sharp as a whip, and this guy was just a technician. I mean, boom. And they were in a tournament, and this big, huge guy did a really stupid move that we would have been trained right away. Don't ever, and he caught a spinning hook kick to the head, and it disconnected the brainstem. And there was, if he had fallen on the emergency room table, they couldn't have saved him. And and I don't think that there was any intention to do that kind of damage. It was just that this is what you're trained, and you see certain things, you react certain ways, and this is what you know. And I think that in a black belt competition, you do make the assumption that your opponent knows how to safeguard themselves. And but so and I can remember being told that they called Master Cho, said, "What how do we think about this?" And he said, "Well, if he joined your school, he'd be alive." And so this is serious stuff, and especially when things happen on the street. Uh, you're playing for keeps sometimes, and which is a reality that the babysitting schools can't address.
So I know that you have a really complex relationship with Peter Lee. You even took his last name. Um, so I'm going to ask you a stupid question, but I'm sure you'll have an interesting answer. What would you say is like the most important um, nugget that you took from your relationship with Peter that was most formative for you?
Peter told me, "Whatever you want to do, you're going to succeed." Said, "You're a smart guy. You apply yourself. Whatever you want to do, you're going to succeed." And I think at where I was at that age, particularly because of my upbringing, it was hard for me to know where I stood. Let's put it that way. And so, I mean, this was a guy that made it through 2 tours of combat in Vietnam and Olympic competition on bicycles, and I saw him. That's part of the thing about an apprenticeship is it's not just a class time thing. I lived in a closet in the school. Like like the door couldn't open, I'd have to like, if I was laying out flat, it was a walk-in closet, right? But, uh, so you see him doing everything. You see how the whole thing goes down. I used to answer the phone when people would call about the classes, and I'd talk to him, and he would always have picked up and be listening to me talking to them, right? I hated that. I just hated it. And then they would hang up, and Peter would be there. Why don't you tell him that? You can't tell him that. You got to tell him this. You got to, So, or, or I would, of course, I had a help around the school, and we're always constantly building on the school and doing things. That's when I first started doing construction, and I worked with a carpenter who was one of the other students, and so he taught me a lot about carpentry and a lot about how things happen in the real world too. He was a funny character. He was a cracker character.
Yeah.
But so Peter would, he'd tell me, "Go do this thing." And I'd take it and I would, maybe the tool wouldn't be right or they'd be saying I'd try and I'd come back and I'd say, "Well, I couldn't do it because this thing doesn't fit or that." And Peter would look at me and he'd give me an eye roll and he'd take the thing out of my hands and then go there and do exactly what I had just told him I couldn't do because, you know, so there was a self-reliant impact that if you're not going to make it through combat as a Green Beret guy for 2 tours if you don't have a certain high degree of self-reliance. And so there was a lot of download of just the way you remember I was speaking before with an episode that dropped just before this one about the difference between propositional knowledge and dispositional knowledge. And the dispositional knowledge is really rooted in what do you do? Like, given a particular situation that's always going to be a one off, it's always going to be a first time you've ever seen it with these particular conflection of events. Uh, so that knowing what to do and learning how to think on your feet, learning how to have that confidence that whatever you could do, you're going to succeed. And whatever the encounter is, you're going to survive it. You just, and to have that not propositionally, but dispositionally, uh, is huge. And so I definitely, and I would go on later, like when I was in college and I was teaching, and I was still in contact with Peter, and I would hit obstacles. And I can remember one time I called Peter because I was teaching a class in school, and there was another guy from another style who was brown belt, and he kept coming to my class. I was still only brown belt at that time. I later went back and stayed with Peter for another year and got my black belt. But at this point, I was brown belt. I was in college, and this guy would come to my class, and he wanted to fight no contact. So we're fighting no contact with him, but then he would always just completely disregard your actions because you weren't getting hit. And then he'd come right through and he'd hit you. And so I told Peter, I said, I've got this one guy. He's kind of a problem because he comes to class and and we think it's no contact. And then he comes, now he's hitting people. And he said to me, "What rank is he?" I said, "Well, he's wearing a brown belt." He says, "You're a brown belt, hit him." And so next time he comes, he's doing the same deal. And I give him a nice little shovel kick right up into the diaphragm. Not any permanent damage thing, but a real wind knocker. So his shoulders are pinned to his knees and he's going trying to suck wind for a while. And that problem went away. But it was one of those things where we have this idea that a soft student needs to be hardened and a hard student needs to be softened. And I was definitely a soft student. I mean, here I was, this white kid had been raised in the suburbs, and most of that earlier formative time was in the Midwest, where everything was kind of slow moving and kind of friendly, and kind of it didn't have. Moving to New York, there was definitely an edge. I definitely had to learn that not everybody could be trusted, and that there were people there that were going to take advantage of you if given the slightest opportunity, and that people that if you showed weakness, that's what they were scanning for to pick out the easy targets. And today's Pink Floyd reference, dogs, right, from
I saw
Animal.
that one coming a mile away.
You
Yep.
you gotta think on your feet because when you're on the street, you gotta be able to pick out the easy meat with your eyes closed. Then moving in silently downwind and out of sight, you've gotta strike when the moment is right without thinking. And you meet those people when you're kinda like, "Hoo, hoo, 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 hoo," coming from, a real and there's a wake-up call there. And, so I did have to harden quite a bit. And, I think Peter was probably the opposite. I think he was the hard student that needed to be softened.
And from things you've said, maybe you even played a role in softening him. Um, so so just being mindful of the topic, I want to pull in another teacher now and kind of ask the same question. And I'm not sure exactly what the order was. I know some of the teachers' names, but the next big teacher, talk about them a little bit, and what was the important formative piece that you took from that relationship?
Yeah. Well, the next, I think, formative teacher was quite a few years later. I went to Santa Fe. I got my black belt. I came back. I opened a school. I ran the school for a while, and that's when I started going through this process of what's really going on here with martial arts practice. And at some point in there, I opened the Keto Institute, which was a 501(c)(3) nonprofit. And that was when I worked in the psych ward and I worked with kids with developmental disabilities and adolescent psych. And that's when I also started getting into uh, some of the Western disciplines to try to understand, to see from, a couple different perspectives what all's going on here. Because I had this idea that we're recapitulating the developmental agenda of the nervous system. But instead of focusing in a dysfunctional situation to get us up to normal, we're actually starting at normal and trying to get to a super functional condition. But the mechanisms are very similar and the apparatus that we're working with is identical. So if I want to get my balance to where I can do 10 spins in a row, on one leg, I'm gonna be working with the same apparatus that I might use with a developmentally disabled child who's still trying to work on basic balance skills. So what might be one step gets broken down into 10 steps and you start to get into it. And so I worked with that's how I ultimately ended up with the Reiki and therapy people, but I went through a number of different lineages, bioenergetics and different body working methodologies and Alexander technique and some things that are really formative. There's somatic practices, uh, and that started to sort of shine a different angle, a different light on the mind body interaction, which is really as we've if for listeners that have been with us before, what's going on in a human where the mind meets matter, there's a fundamental mystery there. And the martial arts do go into that in an interesting way, maybe in more depth than a lot of the other somatic practices we're exposed to. And so that's kind of what really got me interested in internal arts. And so the first teacher that showed up, really, I had picked up Tai Chi forms. I'd worked with some different people that had had exposure to internal arts and were telling me, "Oh yeah, well there's this and there's that," and I actually had heard about this guy before he showed up in Santa Fe, and that was Kumar Francis, who's Bruce Francis is how he's known, but he would go by the name Kumar in those days, and he was one of the first folks into mainland China in '74 when they opened it up to the West. So he was one of the first certified to teach the official Yang form by the one the People's Republic endorses, and uh, and he had a lot of unique exposure. That being of that generation, that first generation to really make it inside to China and to Taiwan, he studied with Wang Suqin and did some work with Ueshiba. In fact, at least he told me about being thrown by Ueshiba, the founder of Aikido, No Sensei, they call him.
Thanks for clarifying.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and, so he had some unique exposure, but he also was high level Shotokan black belt, a lot of exposure in to not just karate, but to some kung fu styles and to judo and stuff like that. So his skill set was far beyond mine, and he had some of that internal component, and that was really my first exposure to that. And I helped him write. I think that was his first book, called "Opening the Energy Gates to the Body," and you'll see a reference to Brian Lee there in the beginning. Uh, and so when I say helped, I mean I typed while he dictated, and we might have discussed ways to say things here and there, but mostly it was just taking dictation. And but it did sort of give me an insider's view. He was probably the first Tai Chi guy I met that I couldn't just beat up. And I had met some masters that maybe I couldn't have beat up, but it certainly wasn't clear, you know. And I had met some that I for sure could beat up. so so which is sort of like a martial artist sense, and uh, in those days I was probably only about 185 pounds, but still, if someone's got 40 pounds on you, boxing classes are by like what, 6 pounds or something like that. So once you get 10 pounds over somebody, this is a significant advantage. And uh, so uh, so but Kumar, he definitely could fight, and he definitely had competition experience, and I fought with him, and I could feel what he had, and so there was definitely some good stuff for me to learn, and he pointed out some things that were missing in my development. So I had things coordinated. I was very loose, which was different than uh, most of the rigid styles, but I didn't have a type of connection that later came when I started practicing internal. And so that brought a whole nother section. But Kumar also was. I mean, I don't remember whether he was claiming mastership in those days or not, but it was clear to me that there were still some rough edges. That while I was interested in the technology that he had, in a martial respect, I was not ready to blow that up into a mastership of reality. And a lot of times people conflate those, or they confuse them. Somebody's good at push hands, they're good at an internal style. That does not mean they're the Buddha. And sometimes they will not be straight up front about that,
Mhm.
you know.
I want to ask about that, but before I do, I want to go back to what you said about one the thing. Maybe I think maybe the formative thing you said you got from Kumar was this connection that you hadn't had prior. And I wonder if you can characterize that more. What do you mean by connection? And I know we're getting into very subjective territory, and it's
Yeah.
hard to get
Well,
the.
no, it's not real subjective. There's two different ways that martial arts work that get broadly, uh, they get distinguished as internal and external. And uh, martial arts, as the story goes, was in what is called the external condition for like 1,500 years. And the way that I usually describe that is I'm going to take a body part and I'm going to speed it up in space and I'm going to bang it into your body. And that's pretty much it. Now, there's a lot of science behind there. And by science, I mean a sort of a generational getting wiser about how to do this. The faster my fist moves, the more force it's going to generate because velocity, is squared in the force formula, mass times velocity squared. So mass is usually something that's limited by my body, but if I can change the relationship and dial down what we call antagonistic resistance, I can move looser and faster than an untrained person. So I can generate more oomph. Just same way that a baseball pitcher who's practiced can throw a faster speed ball, fastball than an untrained person, right? They'll call that jing in internal martial arts. But so the old style is I'm speeding this body part up, but there's some problems with that. One problem is you can see it. Here it comes, right? Dot, 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 like the baseball coming towards you. It's out there in front of God and everybody. And so maybe I know there's an event that's coming up in the very near future. And so maybe I can block it. Maybe I can hit you first instead. Maybe I can kick your feet out. Maybe I can do, something to change it. The internal approach is a little different. Somebody had an essential aha. And the aha was that when I'm speeding a body part up and hitting you with it, it isn't actually the body part that's hitting you. It's the force moving through the body part that's hitting you. So what a lot of internal styles will do is they'll move to what we call the crossing of arms. And then on that contact point, now what the distance that we used to use outside our body to speed up that body part, I'm now going to use the distance hidden inside my body. And it's going to move from my feet. It's going to be controlled. It's going to be generated through the legs, controlled by the waist, and then it's going to issue out into the opponent. And so it's got to have what we call a ground path. It's got to have a line like a whip from the ground that goes all the way up through the body out to the hand. And that pulse is going to move like the curve in the whip. And it's going to accelerate as it goes through each station, like the whip does as it goes from being thick at the base by the handle to being just a very light, small fiber at the end of the whip. But that's the end that cracks because it breaks the sound barrier because it's gone so fast because that acceleration has been uh, it's probably geometrical rather than arithmetical or something like that. So you get a very high speed at the end. So that becomes a very different way to use your body. And your body has to have that connection so that there's no breaks all the way through because I'm putting force through it. And if my body's not organized and I don't have that connection through what I usually refer to as the tendon body, then the force will go out every different kind of way. And then I'm in danger, right? Because then if the force comes out my knee or it comes out my elbow or in a wrong way, then I can damage myself. And I don't mean any quasi mystical force. I mean hitting power coming through the structure. And you could think of the structure as like a gun barrel. I have to hold it in alignment so that it moves into the target at exactly the correct vector. And if I don't, maybe that force will go out my wrist and break my wrist, right? Or if you do push-ups on your fists, you can feel all the alignments that won't work. That if you try to put force through your wrist, it'll actually just break your wrist, right? Or people want to do finger strikes. Well, that it's really you can see all the possibilities for, you know, start banging your fingers into a hard object and you'll feel every little place that the force could go out instead of going into the target. Turns out I can hit really hard with just my fingertips, but I don't do it the way most people do. And so there's a different use of the body even though the picture on the outside, you might not be able to see the difference. But you hear these stories like, oh, he just touched him and he flew away. Well, he didn't just touch him and he flew away. He touched him and then he brought force through his body and put it inside that person's body and then he flew away. You just couldn't see the force because he hit it inside his body. That's why it's internal. That's the idea. Uh, then we develop other technologies. How do I read what's inside some person's body if they haven't shown it to me? We call that dingjing and donjing, which is listening energy and then comprehending energy. That is the ability to know what you're feeling after you've developed the ability to feel it. And then after you do that, then you can manipulate them completely. It's like you've captured them. Right. And that's why they say that when 2 Tai Chi masters meet, when they shake hands, they immediately both of them know who would win. Right. So, uh, but so that's what's fascinating about internal arts is it focuses on, okay, we have mind up here, we have the body down here. What connects those things? And the answer is energy. But a very special kind of bioenergy, and that's what we label chi, which is very controversial. No, chi doesn't exist. Oh, of course chi exists. No, chi doesn't. Well, what do you mean by chi? Well, and then we go off in a thousand little curly cues of question marks. But so the idea of chi shows up in the Neijing, the Huadi Neijing, which is the Huangdi Neijing, which is the Yellow Emperor's internal classic, which is like old, 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 old. Yin and Yang shows up, five elements shows up, Qi shows up. So the question to me has never been, is there such a thing? It's been, what does he mean when he uses that term? Because it meant something to them when they wrote it down. Because these people were not fools, right? And there's a modern idea that says that, well, all this stuff that I don't understand, that's just because they were all fools, and I don't mean fools in the positive way, not capital F fools. They were idiots. And they were just superstitious. Everybody who lived before me, they were all just superstitious. But it turns out that if we put that judgment aside and we make the assumption that there was something they were trying to communicate. And my task is hermeneutic. It's not judgmental. It's can I not misunderstand? Then once I'm successfully not misunderstood, I can start to make evaluations about the relative use or non-usability of this particular fact, right? But this idea that from the outside you say, "Oh, well, they were all fools because I'm modern and I have a smartphone." You know, so because I'm scientific, that's the one that I hear a lot. Well, prove the science to me. It's like, well, I'd much rather see what he can do. Whether I can explain it to you doesn't matter. If he blows me across the room with one shot, then I don't really care whether you understand that or not. I experienced it firsthand, right? Same thing with ceremonies. People can tell me things from their standing outside model of how they think or wish or assume the universe might be. But there's things I've seen. And so the task is on me hermeneutically to not misunderstand what I've experienced. It's not to prove it to anybody else. That's way down the path, right?
Yeah.
I may or may not choose to do that.
So you went down this path of internal arts, and you got some stuff from Bruce Francis, and then that must have been when you were introduced to Bagua, also, right? Because he was a Bagua practitioner.
A little bit.
A little bit, and
Little
but
bit.
then you pursued it, and there was So the next significant teacher.
I think that he did show up relatively soon after that, Zochin Sai, who I think is in LA now. And uh, he was out of a different lineage than the lineage that Kumar came out of, or that Bruce Francis was in. Bruce Francis, what I learned from him mostly was Wu style Tai Chi Chuan that he had learned from Liu Hong Xie, he said, and Xingyi, which he had gotten from Hong Yixiang. Within the, what are they calling it now? Tang Shou Dao was the Hong Yixiang school in Taiwan. And but the Bagua song lineage that they were teaching was from Zhang Feng. Uh, what what Dzogchen called it in those days was Yoshen Lianghuang Bagua, which means swimming body, interlinking circle, 8 trigram palms. But I'm not sure whether he was creating that title or whether that was the title that he got handed on to himself, because there is this idea that within the internal lineages, part of what you learn is all the different generations and the masters in each generation and the things that they brought into the style. And that's part of your sort of understanding your lineage. And so there's a tradition that each master, if they're at a significant level, they bring in their own components in a way that personalizes that style to a high degree. And, which makes sense, I think. But I didn't, I had learned basic circle walking from Kumar, I think, from Bruce Francis, but I didn't really get it. And I don't think I really got chi. It's like I had all of these different practices, but I couldn't really make entire sense out of them. And I wasn't feeling chi in an unquestionable way. Like, and this is the case with a lot of people practicing Tai Chi Chuan. They're like, oh, I feel a little tingling. That must be chi. Or, there's a lot of question. What is chi? What do I feel chi? And then people say, well, if you're alive, you have chi. And if you didn't have chi, you'd be dead. And it's like, yeah, that turns out to be bullshit from people. Like, yeah, it's true, but that's not useful, right? Uh, they're not they need to go through a process to feel what chi is. And that process is laborious and specific. And so I got a pretty good idea of what chi was after I was walking the circle, typically about an hour a day for a year. By the time that year was over, it was unambiguous to me what chi was, and I had developed some ability to direct it a little bit from the outside still, right? And you can direct chi from the outside, you can direct chi from the inside. Shaolin tends to do it from the outside, and the way we'll describe that is we'll call it pushing chi with breath. And that is to say, I'm going to do outside things. I'm going to take a certain posture. I'm going to make certain movements. I'm going to try to put my body in a certain condition. And if I do those things long enough, they will cause chi to move. And then I'll do that a while and I'll build up chi. But the internal way is you link to the chi with your mind and you move the chi. But you can't start there because there's not enough chi for you to grab onto to know what we're talking about, to really be able to make a change or to feel the change when you make it, or to, it's like the levels are so low, it's very subtle and you won't get it. So you do some things to build the flow. And you typically have to do those from the outside. That's why we'll say sometimes at first, do it however you can. Then later on, you work on points for style, right? Another reference to the same song. Uh, but so, for example, pushing chi pushing chi with breath looks like about what you would think that it would be, right? So I can show some of that for the people that aren't on Spotify that can actually see it. And that would be maybe a simple movement pushed with breath. So I might go. Now, I don't know if the camera can catch the goosebumps on there. Can you see the goosebumps?
Yeah.
So so that's exactly the way my skin would be if I went outside and I was cold. Wei Chi, defensive Chi moves to the surface, right? So let me see if I can zero that out now. Let that go back. And now I might do a movement like this without breath. And I'm extending my mind to move the Chi. And I don't know if you can see, but basically you get the same effect. This is a little more easy if you're with me and I can actually show you this. But I've made reference before to the classics where it says we see we see muscle on the surface at the tongue. We see tendon at the surface on the fingernails. We see organ at the surface on the eye. We see chi on the surface on the hair. And that hair, like you can see now, it's not standing up, right? Because I'm not pushing any chi out there. I'm not cold, so I'm not autonomically pushing chi out there. But you saw there, I could push it with breath, which is something consciously that I do doing outside movements, external gymnastic movements, you might say, that are all things that are designed to induce chi to move, but they do it in an external way. But then when I use mind and I lead it the same way, now I'm using an internal method to actually move the chi. And it's a more advanced method. You can't just start doing that. If I couldn't do it with the breath way, I think I would have a very hard time doing it just with mind. There probably are ways to do that, you know, but I think it's much slower. The problem, though, is that if you really get off on pushing breath with chi, you can push it into places where it shouldn't be going because you're not open yet. You can push chi into knots, but you'll never be able to lead it by mind into a knot, right? And so, y- with Wilhelm Reich, a lot of the types of mental imbalance he attributed to stasis anxiety, is what he called it. Energy building up that couldn't flow. And so it makes people crazy. He got into studying masochists who would poke themselves with needles. And the theory at the time was that they were experiencing pain as pleasure. That's not true at all. They experience it just like everybody else does. But it released this energy, this stasis anxiety uh, that allowed the system to rebalance. Curiously, he found that this was usually the case in people that could not access sexual release of energy. So that he has, his theories are often called the economic theory of psychology, right? Because it's
Huh.
about energy exchanges and things. So pushing breath is contraindicated. In the old traditions, you did this with a teacher who could tell you, no, don't do that. You're going to make problems. And he could read and watch along to make sure that none of the contraindications showed up. But now in these days, like a lot of these books, I know for quite a while, Montauk Chia and all his books, he had a lawyer's warning in the front that said, don't be trying this stuff because if you get hurt, we don't want to have anything to do with it. This is just for informational and entertainment purposes so you can understand it, but don't do any of this. Well, that's why he's saying that because, maybe it's safe for 99 out of 100 or 999 out of 1,000. But when the repercussions are bad, they're bad. And so it's irresponsible to do that. But the nice thing about the leading chi with your mind method is you can't you're much safer from those kinds of issues. The problem you have with leading with mind is you may not be doing it and you may be deluding yourself, telling you that, oh, I'm doing this and I'm And there are teachers that just don't get this who are out there teaching Tai Chi and they're saying telling people things like, imagine your body is covered with a golden aura and imagine this is all just nonsense. What we're doing here is very pragmatic. It's either happening or it's not happening. And you have to do the things that you need to do to get it to happen. And the condition of your body might make that different in each case. So,
I never met Peter, but I think I'm starting to recognize Peter's voice when it shows up, and I think that was a little bit of Peter's voice at the end there.
what are you doing? That's Peter. Almost you're crazy. But the funny thing is, that's not Peter. That's Peter channeling Cho,
Sure.
who had a
And now
very
it's your
specific
students
Englishing.
channeling Brian, channeling Peter, channeling Joe.
exactly.
Yep.
And there's this integration thing, where it's how do you make it your own? Because these are just patterns. It's kinda like neurolinguistic programming. Learn the pattern, you get the skill that goes with the pattern,
Yeah.
the ability, so.
Um, is there more to say about your time with So before we wrap, and then maybe we'll come back to other teachers in another episode.
Well, I think the thing, that this chapter with Sifu Zo, Zo Sifu represents is, is maybe, related to that topic we had a few episodes ago about bridging cultures,
Okay.
and that the cultural expectations were amiss. And so when we parted ways, it wasn't because I didn't think that his technology was correct. It was because of judgments that he was making about how to go about things, trying to bridge to American culture. And things that maybe would have been considered acceptable in a traditional Chinese setting that were not gonna fly in the United States. And, so I once we parted companies, I was no longer privy to what experience he was having in that journey. So, uh, but again, it's like I uh, I didn't just study with a series of teachers. When I was running the Dragon Well in Santa Fe, we brought a number of teachers through. We brought Eva Wong from the Feng Loi Kok Taoist Temple Group. We brought Tim Cartmel, who studied quite a bit in Taiwan. We brought George Shu, who was an expert in Chen style and Lanso, and Xin Yi, the 10 animal Xin Yi. And so, so I definitely was always an eclectic, always trying to pull from a number of things. When I made the total list of teachers, I mean, I've worked in brief periods of time with Bong Su-han and with Heel Cho and with Danny Inosanto and with uh, Kenny Gong, with Ben Low, with Wasentha Young, a student of William Chen's, with there's a lot of teachers in there, and each piece they bring, I have to put into my hermeneutical hole and go through that update so that that gives me breadth, even though not all of those teachers did I go into depth with. Now, I'm not advocating just eating hors d'oeuvres and not having a meal. You have to have some traditions that you're really grounded in. But after 30 years, 35 years, 40 years, you can integrate pieces because hopefully you understand the big picture enough that now these things come in and they add real detail. They add an under your, they broaden your understanding of the richness of the field and the different dimensions that it can expand into. Because at some point, shamanism kind of martial arts kind of blurs into shamanism, and shamanism blurs into martial arts. There's spirit boxing. There's in Southeast Asia, they'll do a lot of the silat systems. They're actually kind of calling in energies to inhabit their body, which happened in China also. Uh, I worked with some guys from the Ying Jiao Pai, the Eagle Claw, and their teacher, Shum Leung, in one of his books, he talks about being a child and being in China and seeing a guy who did spirit boxing. And he knew no kung fu in his ordinary reality. He would do like a puja, a sort of devotional thing, kind of go into a trance and then do this incredible monkey kung fu set because he's calling in Hanuman or some the Monkey King or somebody. Does this whole set, collapses unconscious at the end of it, and wakes up. And Shum said that he was convinced that this guy knew no kung fu, but the set that he performed was extreme. I mean, monkey is not an easy style. Of all the styles, monkey is not the easiest style. And Shingy has a little bit of monkey, but that's very different than monkey style. You can't pick up your leg and stick it behind your head. You're going to have trouble with monkey style. And you want to practice your backflips. So
I'll get right on that.
get right on that. It's going to take a couple weekends. Trust me.
Yeah. uh, 30 years ago, it would have taken a couple of weekends.
Yeah. Yep.
Um, cool. Well, maybe let's leave it there, Brian. I hadn't thought about the teachers, outside of martial arts, but there's a whole shamanism component we can get into too. So we can
And a
come back to
craftsmanship
that.
component too.
Yeah. Okay. So let's
You know,
come do a part two in a while. And meanwhile, enjoy the rain and best of luck to you. And we'll talk soon.
sounds good. We'll see you next time. Goodbye,
Thanks,
everybody.
Brian.
Have a good one.